Let me tell you a story that I could have never imagined living even in my wildest dreams. I am Mariana, I am 25 years old, and I'm going to share how what started with furtive glances from my father-in-law ended up in a scandal with my boyfriend. It all began on a sunny Saturday morning. My boyfriend, Andrés, called me with that sweet voice that always makes me smile. He told me he had a surprise for me and that I should come to his house that night. Excitement coursed through every fiber of my being. I couldn't wait to find out what he had in store. The relationship with Andrés was something special. We had known each other since high school, and despite a few silly fights, we had managed to build something strong and genuine. He was the kind of guy all the girls would envy, and sometimes I surprised myself for having him by my side. He worked at a tech company and was always busy. But he always found time for me. That night, I arrived at his house, thrilled and wondering what the surprise could be. Andrés greeted me with a radiant smile and a tight hug. "I have to work early tomorrow, but I'd like you to stay. How about spending the night here?" he proposed. Although my initial thought was a resounding yes, the concern that my presence might delay him the next day made me hesitate a bit. But he reassured me that it would be fine, and we should enjoy the night together. While we spent time in the living room, I couldn't help but notice how his father, Mr. Rodríguez, kept looking at me constantly. He was a strong and mature man with a deep, penetrating gaze that always made me feel a little uncomfortable. Over the months, I had noticed how he tracked my movements with his eyes, as if he were calculating every step I took. I always tried to ignore those thoughts, convincing myself that they were just my imagination. Here I am, trying to put into words a part of my life that, well, is quite challenging to explain. If someone had told me a few months ago that I would be in the middle of this madness, I wouldn't have believed it, not even in my wildest dreams. But, well, here we go. Before that day when my boyfriend Andrés invited me to spend the night at his house, things took a turn I couldn't have imagined. Mr. Rodríguez, his dad, had always looked at me in a somewhat different way. It was as if his eyes had a magnet that drew me in, but I tried to ignore it. After all, he was my father-in-law, and the thought of having strange thoughts didn't even cross my mind. However, as days and weeks passed, those intense gazes became more and more frequent. Whenever he was nearby, whether in the living room watching a movie or in the kitchen preparing dinner, I noticed his eyes following my every move. It seemed as if he wanted to read my thoughts, and the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't help it. I still remember that day when I was helping Mrs. Rodríguez set the table for a family dinner. As I folded the napkins, I felt his intense gaze on me. I felt uncomfortable, but there wasn't much I could do except nervously smile and try to keep the conversation as normal as possible. Although on the inside, my mind was a whirlwind of questions and conflicting emotions. What's curious is that, despite feeling those longing looks, I continued with my life. Andrés and I remained a happy couple, and every time I felt uncomfortable with his father's gaze, I just tried to avoid the subject and focus on my relationship with him. After all, there was no point in thinking about things I assumed were just in my head. The months leading up to that particular day were filled with strange moments. Sometimes, when everyone was in the living room watching a movie, Mr. Rodríguez and I would find ourselves alone in the kitchen for a moment. In those moments, our conversations became longer and more personal. We shared anecdotes and thoughts we hadn't shared with anyone else. It was as if we had a special connection, something I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. I don't know exactly when things started to change. It was as if the very air was charged with desire whenever we were close. Every casual encounter in the house became a dangerous game of glances and whispered words. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing lines I shouldn't cross, but sometimes it's hard to stop when you're drawn to something you can't fully understand. So here I am, trying to sort out my thoughts and emotions as I navigate this unfamiliar territory. I can't help but wonder how we got to this point and if there's any way to go back. My mind is a whirlwind of doubts, and as I continue with this story, I know there's no turning back. What follows is an uncertain and dangerous path, and I have no idea how we'll get out of this. So, we arrive at that day when I stayed overnight at Andrés's house. After dinner, we all sat in the living room, his mom, his dad, Andrés, and me. We chatted, laughed, and had a good time. It was one of those family nights we enjoyed together, and everything seemed as normal as ever. Finally, we decided to watch a movie together. We settled on the couch, Andrés by my side, his dad in his favorite armchair, and his mom on the other couch. The movie started, and honestly, I struggle to remember what it was about. My mind was elsewhere, lost, filled with emotions and thoughts. After a while, Andrés and I decided it was time to retire for the night. We got up from the couch, and as we headed to the room we shared, I felt a knot in my stomach. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in the air, a tension that made me nervous. We got into the room, and Andrés closed the door behind us. He looked at me with that smile that always made me feel special and held me close. At that moment, everything seemed in order. But my thoughts were elsewhere, and I couldn't shake off those intense looks and the weight of what was happening between his dad and me. We spent some time in conversation, and he told me about his plans for the weekend, his work, and other light topics. I tried to keep the conversation flowing, but every time I looked into his eyes, I couldn't help but feel that he was hiding something. It was as if the weight of our shared secrets was in the room with us. Finally, we turned off the lights and settled into sleep. But despite the fatigue, my mind was everywhere except sleep. My thoughts raced, and my consciousness struggled to stay afloat amid this confusion. I knew something was wrong, that our actions weren't just innocent conversations or shared glances. In the darkness, I felt that the room was filled with secrets. I couldn't help but wonder if Andrés knew something, if he suspected something strange between his father and me. But then, why would he continue to act normal? It was as if we were living in two different worlds, one filled with laughter and moments together as a couple, and another dark and dangerous, which I only shared with Mr. Rodríguez. Time passed slowly, and each tick of the clock seemed to resonate in my head. Andrés was fast asleep beside me, oblivious to the storm raging in my mind. I turned in bed, unable to find a comfortable position. As I struggled to find sleep, a part of me knew that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated and dangerous. After all the thoughts from the previous night, I finally managed to fall asleep. The bed in Andrés's room was comfortable, and fatigue overcame me despite my worries. My eyes closed, and for a while, I could rest from everything that was happening. However, as they say, all good things must come to an end. It was 7 in the morning when Andrés's alarm woke me up. Though I was still half asleep, I knew I had to go to work early. I felt him move in bed and heard the sound of the shower. It was clear he was going about his daily routine before leaving. Even though I had my eyes closed, I was aware of every little sound in the house. I heard Andrés's steps as he moved around the room, choosing his clothes and gathering his things. Then, suddenly, I felt like he leaned over me and gave me a gentle kiss on the forehead. "I have to go to work, sweetheart. I don't want to wake you, rest a little longer," he said in a low voice. Those moments before his departure were strange. I knew he was leaving me alone in his house with his parents. Although I had always had a good relationship with them, I now felt a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. As I heard the door close behind him, my heart raced. I lay in bed, looking up at the ceiling in the semi-darkness. The house was quiet, and for a moment, the reality of the situation hit me hard. I was alone in my in-laws' house, and everything that had been happening between Mr. Rodríguez and me felt like a shadow looming over me. My thoughts went back to the night before, to those intense looks and shared conversations. I felt trapped in a tangle of emotions I couldn't control. I knew what I was doing was wrong, that I was jeopardizing my relationship with Andrés and the stability of his family. But the attraction I felt toward his father was an unstoppable force pulling me towards him. Time passed slowly as I remained alone in the house. I heard occasional noises from outside, but mostly, I was lost in my thoughts. I wondered how I had reached this point and what the heck I was going to do about it. My conscience weighed heavily on me, and every passing second seemed to worsen the guilt I felt. Finally, I decided to get up and face the day. I stood up and looked around the room. There was no sign of Andrés, only a few of his belongings were scattered around. I stretched and yawned, trying to push my worries out of my mind. Although I knew facing his parents would be uncomfortable, I couldn't stay in bed forever. With a sigh, I decided to take a shower and freshen up a bit. As the hot water flowed over me, I felt a bit more awake and focused. Maybe it was time to face reality and try to sort out this mess I had created. I didn't know how I would do it, but I was determined to find a solution. If you've ever felt like your life takes a 180-degree turn in a second, then you know exactly what I'm feeling right now. After the shower, I decided to go to Andrés's room to change. I wrapped myself in a towel and opened the bathroom door. I walked toward the room, and when I was about to enter, the world seemed to pause for a moment. Guess who was there? Yes, Mr. Rodríguez, my father-in-law. I can't believe this is happening. I don't know who was more surprised, if he heard. We stood there in a moment of pure awkwardness and surprise. His gaze traveled up and down me, and I felt my skin tingling under his scrutiny. That moment felt like an eternity, and my thoughts raced at full speed. How had we reached this moment? How had we gone from intense looks to being in this uncomfortable situation? Finally, I managed to stammer some words. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here," I said, my voice trembling with embarrassment. He smiled a kind of smile that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't worry, Mariana. You have nothing to hide," he replied calmly but filled with insinuation. What happened next is hard to describe. Instead of stepping away or apologizing for the awkward encounter, Mr. Rodríguez began to flirt with me. It was as if we were playing with fire, but I couldn't stop feeling attracted to that man who had always had an inexplicable hold over me. I told myself that I should stay away, that this was wrong and didn't make sense, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. The conversation became more intense, filled with innuendos and suggestive gestures. I don't know how it happened, but in the midst of that tension, we got even closer. And before I knew it, we were face to face, our gazes locked on each other. The air was charged with electricity, and every part of my being was alert. That's when it happened. A touch, a minimal gesture but loaded with desire, and suddenly everything changed. My lips met his in a kiss that defied all rules and boundaries. It was as if the world faded away around us, and only he and I existed in that moment. It was a mix of emotions, excitement, and guilt intertwining inside me. I can't lie, that moment was passionate and intense. But it was also a turning point in my life. A line we crossed without thinking about the consequences. I didn't know what would happen next, how I would face Andrés, and how I would deal with the burden of what I had done. But in that moment, I was caught in a vortex of emotions and desires that left me breathless. Then, Mr. Rodríguez and I separated a bit, both of us breathing heavily. We didn't need words to understand what had just happened. But there was a new level of tension in the air, and the weight of our actions began to weigh heavier than ever. After that moment in Andrés's room, we were in the process of changing, trying to come to terms with what had happened. My mind was in total chaos, and I didn't know how to face what we had done. But then, In the midst of that whirlwind of thoughts, the worst happened. The door suddenly opened, and my heart stopped in my chest. It was Mrs. Rodríguez, Andrés's mother. She looked at me in surprise, and her expression changed from surprise to confusion, and finally to disappointment. In that moment, I felt like the world was crumbling around me. I didn't know what to say or do, so I just stood there, paralyzed, unable to find words. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Rodríguez looked from me to her husband, and in her eyes, there was a mix of anger and sadness. I knew something was happening, that our actions had been discovered. I couldn't bear her gaze any longer. I felt like a child caught in the act, and the feeling of guilt overwhelmed me. She sighed, and her words came out as a whisper filled with pain. "I thought you were part of our family, Mariana. I never imagined you would do something like this." I couldn't hold back my tears any longer, and although I wanted to apologize over and over again, I knew my words no longer had meaning. I got up from the bed, my body trembling, and gathered my things mechanically. I knew there was no way to fix what I had done, that I would have to carry this guilt for the rest of my life. After that devastating day at my in-laws' house, things were never the same. The tension was too great, and although I tried to talk to Andrés and explain what had happened, it was in vain. Our relationship, which had once seemed strong and unbreakable, crumbled like a house of cards. The conversation with Andrés was painful and full of tears. I tried to explain the inexplicable, to apologize and ask for forgiveness, but his eyes were filled with disappointment and betrayal. There was no way to undo what I had done, no way to turn back time and erase that dark chapter from our lives. The worst part was accepting that I had not only lost Andrés, but I had also destroyed the relationship between his father and mother. My in-laws' marriage, which had once seemed solid, had broken due to my irresponsible and selfish actions. The confrontation I witnessed between them that day was the beginning of the end of their relationship, and the weight of that guilt fell on my shoulders. The truth is, I felt miserable. I felt the weight of guilt and shame every day, and I knew I deserved all of that and more. I had betrayed the trust of the people who mattered most in my life, and that haunted me. Not only had I lost my boyfriend, but I had also lost my own integrity and values. The next step was facing the consequences of my actions in everyday life. I had lost an important part of my life, and that left a void in my heart that I didn't know how to fill. I tried to move on, tried to find a way to fix everything, but I couldn't escape the truth of what I had done. The gaze of my friends and family was filled with judgment and unspoken questions. Everyone knew what had happened. And though I tried to hide my shame behind a smile, I knew I couldn't fool anyone. I had damaged my reputation and my integrity, and that was something I couldn't ignore. Thank you for being part of this captivating story of infidelity. If you want to continue enjoying and exploring other exciting stories, I invite you to subscribe. Join our community so you don't miss a single video. Click the subscribe button to receive instant updates on our upcoming stories. I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Don't miss it, subscribe now, and discover a world of fascinating stories.